You know, one of the most confusing things about dealing with someone with avoidant tendencies is how quickly they can go cold, and yet how obsessed they become the moment you finally step away. It's like a switch flips. You're sitting there wondering how someone who seems so indifferent is now suddenly watching your stories, liking old posts, or finding ways to reappear in your life. What's happening there? It all comes back to something subtle, something we often miss when we're too deep in the emotional fog of that connection. Avoidants don't hate intimacy, they fear it. And when you go no contact, you unknowingly remove the very thing that scared them the most: pressure. When you're in the relationship or situation with an avoidant, you're often chasing connection. You're reaching out, trying to understand them, trying to pull more affection, more clarity, more commitment, and they in turn are pulling back. Not necessarily because they don't like you or don't care, but because that intensity begins to feel like a demand they can't meet. Every good morning text, every where do we stand conversation, every emotional check-in, it piles up as pressure. Pressure to be available, pressure to be emotionally present, pressure to be vulnerable when their default setting is self-protection. So when you finally stop, when you pull away, not as a tactic, but because you're genuinely done, that pressure evaporates. Suddenly, they're no longer feeling suffocated by the expectations of intimacy. They're not being asked to show up in ways that make them feel exposed. And in that silence, something interesting happens. They start to relax. Now, here's the part that most people don't realize. When an avoidant relaxes, that's when their feelings surface. You see, when someone is in fight or flight mode, which is where avoidants often live emotionally, their priority is safety, not connection. But when they feel safe, when there's no one chasing them, no emotional demands knocking at their door, they're able to feel the very thing they've been running from: you, your energy, your warmth, your presence, and they begin to miss it. Not just because you're gone, but because now there's space. Space for them to reflect without being triggered. Space for them to fantasize about the connection without fearing its implications. Space to think about you without having to deal with the responsibilities that came with being with you. That's where the addiction begins. It's not even about who you are anymore. It's about how they feel when you're not around. Safe, curious, pulled. There's something deeply ironic about it. While you were available, loving, open, they felt pressure. But the moment you stepped away, the exact qualities that made them retreat are now the ones they crave. Your consistency becomes valuable. Your emotional availability becomes rare. Your absence becomes attractive. And if you're sitting there thinking, that's so backwards, you're right, it is. But emotions don't always follow logic, especially in people who've spent years building defenses around their hearts. What you need to understand is that no contact doesn't just create distance. It creates a different experience of you. Before, they experienced you as the person who wanted more than they could give. Now, they experience you as the person they can no longer access. That shift changes everything, because in your silence, there's no pressure, there's no conflict, there's no we need to talk texts, there's just quiet. And that quiet becomes the container for desire, for longing, for memory. It gives them the space to realize what they miss, what they felt, what they didn't say, and more importantly, what they might lose for good. And here's where it gets even deeper. For an avoidant, control is their comfort zone. When they were pushing you away, they had control. They set the emotional terms. But when you go no contact, when you walk away with grace and dignity, you disrupt that control. You reclaim your power. And in doing so, you become unpredictable, mysterious, alluring. And that mystery is like a magnet for someone who once felt too in control of the situation. They can't predict you anymore. They can't feel certain about your love. They can't guarantee your return. That uncertainty, the very thing that scared you when they were being avoidant, is now the thing that eats away at them because it puts them in the position they've spent their whole life avoiding. Vulnerability. That's the paradox. You had to lose them to be seen. You had to walk away to be appreciated. You had to stop loving out loud for them to hear the silence. And I'm not saying this to encourage games or manipulative tactics. This isn't about playing hard to get. It's about recognizing your value and understanding the psychology of someone who only realizes what they had once it's gone. That realization doesn't come when you're constantly reminding them of your love. It comes when they're left alone with their own thoughts. And those thoughts are haunted by the ghost of your presence. So when you're wondering why that avoidant ex, the one who couldn't commit, the one who pulled away every time things got close, is now orbiting around you, checking in, sending random texts, or trying to reappear with subtle gestures, know this: it's not just that they miss you. It's that in your absence, they finally feel something. And for people who've spent their lives numbing and avoiding, feeling anything becomes addictive. And that's the power of no contact. You see, there's something deeply psychological about how human beings perceive value. And one of the most powerful drivers of value is scarcity. It's not because we're shallow or manipulative. It's because our brains are wired to pay more attention to what we no longer have immediate access to. And that is never more true than when we're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies. Avoidants, by their nature, struggle with consistent intimacy. They might crave closeness in short, controlled bursts, but as soon as things start to feel too emotionally intense, they pull away. They might disappear, get cold, or create distance just to feel safe again. But what's fascinating is what happens when you stop reaching out, when you go no contact, when you remove yourself from the equation completely. Suddenly the emotional dynamic flips. What used to feel abundant, your attention, your affection, your presence, is now gone. It's not accessible anymore. And for someone who's used to you always being there in some form, that absence creates a vacuum. The space you used to occupy is now empty. And that's when scarcity kicks in. Not because they've had a change of heart overnight, but because they're beginning to feel the cost of your absence. And this isn't about playing games. It's about what naturally happens when someone realizes that what they took for granted is no longer guaranteed. When you were texting back quickly, showing up emotionally, being available, there was nothing forcing them to evaluate what your presence meant. You were just there. And in that comfort, they never had to ask themselves the hard questions. But when you step back and that noise stops, it disrupts everything. Now they're left sitting in silence. And suddenly, your voice, your energy becomes louder in their head, not because you're there, but because you're not. Avoidants often struggle with delayed emotional reactions, while someone more secure might miss you immediately after a breakup or a distancing period. An avoidant might only begin to process their emotions once the dust has settled, when they feel like no one is chasing them, when their space is finally restored. That's when they begin to think, wait, where did they go? Why haven't they called? Were they really done? It becomes a slow burn, and the very space they thought they needed becomes the thing that triggers their longing. Because here's the truth. Avoidants often only feel safe enough to want you once you're no longer emotionally in reach. That's when desire begins to resurface. The irony is that your absence gives them the very thing they needed to feel emotionally safe, space. But it also makes you a more valuable, more intriguing figure in their mind. You become the one who didn't chase, the one who respected themselves enough to walk away, the one who didn't try to force love where it wasn't being reciprocated. That's magnetic. And here's something important. When something is constantly available, it's easy to undervalue it. Think about it like this. If you had your favorite song playing on repeat all day long, eventually it becomes background noise. But the moment you turn it off for a few days and then hear it again, it hits differently. You remember why you loved it. It feels new, special, meaningful. That's exactly what happens when you go no contact with an avoidant. You're no longer background noise. You're not part of their emotional wallpaper. You're gone. And that makes them feel your presence in a way they never allowed themselves to before, because they're no longer distracted by your closeness. They're confronted by your absence. That absence creates tension, not necessarily the dramatic kind, but the slow creeping realization that you meant more to them than they allowed themselves to admit. And without the comfort of your consistent love, they start to feel the void. That's when they begin to reminisce, not about the fights or the friction, but about your smile, your patience, your care, your jokes, the moments of peace that came with being with you. Now, here's where it gets really powerful. Your absence forces them to rewrite the narrative they told themselves. Before, they may have said, I don't want anything serious, or I need space, or this isn't the right time. But now, those words echo in their own mind, and the silence that follows becomes a mirror that reflects back a version of them who may have pushed something away that was actually good for them. You didn't become more valuable because you begged, pleaded, or proved your worth. You became more valuable because you withdrew your energy. You showed that your presence is not to be taken lightly, that your love is not on tap, that your time and heart are not for people who don't know how to hold them. That's where the addiction begins to form. Because in the quiet, they're left with a craving not just for someone, but for you. And that craving is heightened because you're no longer available in the way you once were. You've reclaimed your peace. You've chosen yourself. And that self-respect becomes irresistible, not just attractive, it becomes unforgettable. They start to scroll through old texts, revisit photos. They play back your voice messages and search for signs they missed. They overanalyze the way you left, trying to find clues that maybe, just maybe, there's still a door open. But the truth is, they're not addicted to you in the way most people think. They're addicted to the version of you they can no longer access. And once that realization sets in, they can't help but feel it, feel the pull, feel the weight of what they let go. Not because you manipulated the situation, but because you allowed the silence to speak louder than any words ever could. And that's the power of scarcity. It doesn't just increase desire, it deepens awareness. Because the moment they realize you were rare is the moment they begin to feel your worth. You see, there's something really interesting about how avoidants react when you stop chasing them. The dynamics shift entirely, and this is where things get fascinating. Avoidants, as much as they might deny it or disguise it, are used to being the ones in control. The chase is something they're comfortable with. It's a dance they know well. They like the idea of someone pursuing them, seeking their attention, validating their importance. It feeds their ego in ways that most of us don't even realize. But here's the kicker. The moment you stop chasing, everything changes. You might think that when you pull back, the avoidant will simply be relieved, as they tend to pull away from emotional closeness anyway. But what happens instead is this shift, this moment when they're no longer in control of the situation. And when the power dynamic changes like this, something really interesting happens. The script they've been following suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. It's like someone has just changed the rules in the middle of the game, and now they're left scrambling to understand what's going on. They were used to you being the one who was always there, always eager for their attention. You were the one doing the chasing, trying to prove your worth, trying to get them to let you in. And let's face it, most of us are conditioned to do this, aren't we? We chase because we want to feel valued, because we want to feel loved and needed. But when you stop doing that, when you take a step back and reclaim your own power, it forces them to confront something they've been avoiding for a long time, their own need for validation. Here's the thing about avoidance. They're not as emotionally detached as they seem. They have feelings, just like everyone else, but they've learned to bury those feelings, to suppress them, because in their world, feeling vulnerable is risky. It's a threat to their independence. But the moment you pull back and stop chasing, the emotional vacuum you create leaves them grappling with an intense mix of curiosity and fear. Curiosity, because now they're wondering, what happened? Why aren't you pursuing me anymore? And fear, because they're not sure if they've lost something they didn't fully realize they valued until it was no longer in their grasp. You see, when you stop chasing, you don't just stop doing the work, you send them a message that's loud and clear. I'm not here to chase you, I'm here to be chosen. I have my own life, my own boundaries, and my own value. That message is incredibly powerful because it's the very thing they've been subconsciously afraid of. They've been used to the attention, used to people making them the center of their universe. But now the tables have turned and they're no longer the ones being pursued. They become the pursuer, and it's a role they don't know how to play well. Here's where it gets really interesting. The dynamic of them being chased was a comfort zone. It kept them at arm's length, allowing them to engage just enough to feel desired, but never so much that they had to expose themselves emotionally. But now, with you backing off, they're forced to reckon with something they've avoided for a long time. The realization that they need someone just as much as you need them. And that's the emotional tug of war that starts to play out. It's important to understand that avoidants don't avoid relationships or connection entirely. They just avoid the kind of deep emotional intimacy that requires vulnerability. So when you stop chasing them, you're forcing them to confront their own fears. They'll find themselves thinking about you more, missing the attention they once took for granted. They may start to feel a sense of loss, and the need to get back to what they had with you suddenly becomes something they want to solve. It's like a puzzle they need to piece together, and they're not used to not having all the pieces in place. At this point, they may start questioning what happened, wondering if they let something great slip through their fingers. And this is where the magic happens. By taking a step back, you create space for them to realize that they might actually care more than they let on. The absence of your pursuit makes them reflect on the emotional value of what they had with you. In their mind, they've been programmed to value the thrill of the chase, to appreciate the game of keeping someone interested without fully letting them in. But when you stop playing that game, they have no choice but to confront the reality of their own desires and needs. And let's be honest here, it's not just about the relationship with you, it's about them facing their own vulnerabilities. Avoidants often struggle with the balance between wanting connection and wanting independence. It's like they're torn between two desires, the desire for closeness and the desire for freedom. When you stop chasing them, you're not just removing yourself emotionally, you're also removing the crutch they've been using to maintain that delicate balance. And that's why it's so powerful. You stop playing the role they've conditioned themselves to expect, and in doing so, you make them question everything they thought they knew about relationships. The fact that you're not chasing them anymore forces them to shift gears. Now, they're the ones who need to work out how to keep you in their life. They need to step up in ways they weren't accustomed to. And that requires them to face feelings of attachment and dependency they usually avoid. The result? They become addicted to the idea of getting back what they had. And perhaps even more because they're now seeing you from a different perspective. It's a tricky situation for them because they've learned to keep emotions at bay, to protect themselves from the vulnerability that comes with opening up. But once you've stopped chasing them, once you've shifted the dynamic, they start to realize that the emotional investment they were avoiding might be worth exploring after all. It's no longer just a game of maintaining distance. It's about deciding whether to let you back in. Ultimately, by stepping away, you give them the space to realize that they want more from you than they initially allowed themselves to admit. And in doing so, you've shown them the kind of relationship dynamic they didn't even know they needed. You've forced them to confront their emotional walls. And that's where the real attraction begins. The chase, as they knew it, is over. But the desire to reclaim what they had with you, that's just beginning. And with that, the lesson is simple. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop chasing, step back, and let them come to you. You know, one of the most fascinating dynamics with avoidance is how they often operate under a set of emotional rules that they themselves don't fully understand. They're experts at keeping people at arm's length, never quite letting anyone get too close. It's not necessarily because they don't care. It's more about the fact that they fear being overwhelmed by the emotions they're carrying inside. Now, when you're in contact with them, you might feel like you're on this emotional roller coaster where everything is uncertain because they're constantly pushing you away one moment and then they're drawn back in the next. Here's the truth though. When you go no contact with them, something shifts. Suddenly, they don't have that constant shield of space between the two of you, that emotional distance that they use to protect themselves from their own vulnerability. And the interesting thing is, by stepping back, you're not just giving them space, you're giving them something far more powerful. You're giving them the mirror they've spent so long avoiding. Think about this. Avoidants tend to be experts at running from discomfort. They'll often bury their feelings, downplay them, or just outright deny that they have them. Emotional closeness to them feels like a threat because it means confronting things they've been avoiding for a long time, feelings they don't quite know how to handle. But when you cut contact, you're no longer there to create the emotional environment that might force them to deal with all of this. Instead, they're left with nothing but themselves and their emotions. Now, don't mistake this for them suddenly realizing they miss you in the way you might hope. It's not that simple. But what happens is this: the absence of your presence forces them to reckon with something they've been avoiding for a long time. They can't keep pushing away the idea of what could have been. They start questioning everything: the conversations, the moments you shared, the chemistry. They're sitting there, alone with their thoughts, and something starts to stir that they've been too afraid to deal with before. Their emotions come rushing to the surface, uninvited, and they can't run away from them. In a way, you become the unresolved story in their mind. The relationship or the potential for it is left unfinished, a mystery they can't quite figure out. There's a sense of loss, yes, but more than that, there's this deep, insistent curiosity about why you chose to go silent. It's almost as if they've been given a puzzle with a missing piece, and now they can't stop thinking about it. The absence creates space for them to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions and fears. But ultimately, it's that uncertainty, that unknown, that pulls them back in. They can't let go of what hasn't been fully resolved. Now, some people might argue that no contact just makes them more distant, and maybe for a time it does. But here's where it gets interesting. Avoidance doesn't equate to indifference. It just means they struggle with emotional intimacy. But when you disappear, you don't give them the chance to avoid their feelings anymore. You're not there to distract them, not there to create a constant dynamic of push and pull. And that's when the walls they've carefully built around their heart start to crack. Without you around, they have no choice but to turn inward and confront all those feelings they've been pushing down. And let me tell you, that can be one of the most uncomfortable things for them. You might think that by going silent, you've made things worse, or maybe you fear that you're being too much for them. But that's not the case. You've given them space to grow, to realize, to miss you. The difference between being too much and creating the emotional environment where they have no choice but to confront their fears is subtle but crucial. Sometimes, to make real progress in any relationship, you have to step away so the other person can see just how much they really value you, not in a moment of neediness, but in a moment of clarity. It's a strange thing, really. When someone is constantly in your face, asking for more attention, seeking reassurance from you, it's easy to take that for granted. But when you step back, when you create that gap, it forces them to experience the absence and understand just how much they really want, how much they're missing. You become this phantom, this almost perfect version of yourself that they now can't quite shake. They can't unsee the potential you represented. The only way they can regain that sense of connection is by closing the emotional gap. And that's when they start to pay attention. But here's where things get even more complicated. This doesn't mean they're immediately going to come running back to you with open arms. Avoidants don't work that way. They don't jump straight into vulnerability. It's too threatening for them. But what happens is that this absence, this space, becomes a powerful emotional trigger. They feel your absence in a way they can't explain. And over time, they begin to realize that they have to face the discomfort they've been avoiding. The longer that space remains, the more they can't deny the pull they feel toward you. And it's not just about the missing physical presence. It's about what you represent. You represent someone who didn't chase them, didn't beg for their attention, didn't try to fill the silence with desperate attempts at closeness. You showed them that you have your own life, your own boundaries, your own self-worth. And that, more than anything, is what becomes magnetic to them. That's the key. What they crave, more than anything, is not someone who will chase them endlessly or constantly validate them. They crave someone who stands firm, who respects their space, but knows how to pull back when necessary. By stepping away, you've shown them that kind of strength. And that strength, it's incredibly attractive, even to someone who's terrified of getting close. In the end, it's not about manipulation or playing games. It's about allowing them to confront their own emotional limitations without you being there to enable them. You gave them the space to grow, to miss you, and ultimately to realize that they can't run from what they feel. It's a powerful shift, and one that doesn't need any words or actions on your part to make it happen. So while the path of no contact isn't easy, it's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it might even feel like a test at times, it's also the most direct route to allowing both of you to move forward. And when they're finally able to face those fears, that's when the real change begins. One of the most powerful dynamics in any relationship is the need for closure. It's not just about having the final conversation or tying up loose ends. It's deeper than that. We all, in our own ways, want to understand what went wrong, what went right, and why things ended the way they did. But here's the thing about avoidance. They run from closure. They run from anything that would require them to feel their feelings, to process what just happened, or to face the vulnerability that comes with truly understanding another person. Now, I know it sounds like a paradox. You think, how could they not want closure? Isn't that what we all need? But avoidants approach relationships a little differently. They have this deep, almost subconscious fear of emotional dependence. So when things start to get too close, too intimate, they pull away. Not because they don't care, but because they fear losing themselves in someone else. They fear being swallowed up by someone else's needs, emotions, and desires. But here's where the magic happens. When you decide to go no contact, when you remove yourself from the equation, you stop being a part of their emotional drama. You stop being the person they can avoid facing. And that's exactly what an avoidant needs, whether they admit it or not. They need space to breathe, to step back, and to start seeing their own feelings from a distance. But they don't always know how to do that. So when you disappear, something shifts. You stop being that thing they can run from. Instead, you become something they can't resolve. It's almost like you become an unfinished story in their mind. They're trying to make sense of it. They're replaying every moment they spent with you, trying to decode what you really meant, what your actions really meant, and why things ended the way they did. Because here's the thing, they don't like unfinished business. They might not admit it to themselves, but that lack of closure nags at them. It keeps them up at night. It makes them wonder if they could have handled things differently. And let's face it, if they really did care, they're going to wonder about you. They're going to wonder about what was real between the two of you. What happens in their mind is a constant cycle. The questions swirl. Was that real? Were they just another person who wanted too much of me? Or was I the one pushing them away? And with you gone, with you stepping back and leaving them to their thoughts, they have no one else to project those questions onto, no one else to blame or avoid. It forces them to confront their own behavior. And that's something avoidants are usually terrified of, because it's not just about you anymore. It's about them. You see, the avoidant isn't just avoiding you. They're avoiding themselves. They're avoiding the parts of themselves that crave intimacy, that crave connection, but are too afraid to reach for it. They want the closeness, but they don't know how to have it without feeling like they're going to lose their independence. And when you go no contact, you stop being the person who makes them feel that tension. Now they're left with their own internal conflict. And that's when the obsession starts. In their minds, you've become this unresolved puzzle. You're not something they can just walk away from easily anymore, because without closure, everything remains open. And when something is left unfinished, it often becomes the focus of our thoughts. That's why they'll replay conversations in their heads, replay every moment they spent with you, trying to figure out what they missed, why it didn't work out, and whether they should have acted differently. They'll start to see your absence as a kind of emotional mystery. And let's be honest here, most people, especially avoidants, are not comfortable with unresolved mysteries. It keeps them up at night, keeps them thinking. And that thinking turns into this obsession. It's a kind of emotional itch they can't scratch. But the problem is, this obsession doesn't always lead to growth. It doesn't lead to the clarity they think it will. Instead, it often keeps them stuck in a cycle of confusion. The avoidant starts questioning everything they thought they knew about their feelings. They'll ask themselves things like, why didn't they need me the way I thought they did? Or did I push them away too much? And that's the tricky thing about avoidance. They often don't learn how to deal with their emotions until they're forced to. And by stepping away, you've put them in a position where they have no choice but to face it. And that's where the power of no contact really comes into play. It's not about playing games or trying to manipulate them. It's about giving them the space to confront themselves. You've taken yourself out of the equation, and now they have to look at their own emotions, their own fears, their own patterns. And let's be clear, most avoidants don't want to face these things. They've built their entire lives around avoiding their emotions, around running from closeness, around keeping people at arm's length. So when you walk away, it forces them to acknowledge what they've been avoiding. And that's why they get addicted to the idea of you. They can't stop thinking about what you represented, what you made them feel, and what they've lost. But here's the kicker. This doesn't mean they're going to run back to you immediately. Avoidants need time. They need space to process everything. They need to convince themselves they're still in control of their own emotions. But the truth is, their emotional walls have started to crack, even if they don't admit it. And over time, this space, this distance you've created becomes a magnet. They start to crave the mystery you've become. They crave the emotional resolution that they haven't gotten yet. In the end, you've become this powerful force in their life, not because you're chasing them or trying to pull them closer, but because you've chosen to respect yourself enough to step back. And when you step back, they're left to deal with the feelings they've been avoiding for so long. You've stopped being the person they can run away from. You've become the person they can't forget. And that's a powerful position to be in. You've got to understand something fundamental about attraction. It's not about needing someone to complete you. It's about being so solid and self-assured in your own world that someone else can come into it and add to it. Now, here's the truth. When you step away and go no contact, you're not just disappearing. No, you're doing something much more powerful. You're reclaiming your power. And that power isn't just in the absence, it's in the message that sends to them. The truth is, when you go no contact, it isn't just about pulling away physically, it's about setting boundaries. It's about telling someone, I respect myself enough to walk away if this dynamic doesn't serve me. I know my worth. And that is magnetic. That is the kind of energy that an avoidant can't help but notice. Here's why. Avoidants have this innate fear of being engulfed. They want intimacy, but they fear it at the same time. They want connection, but they don't want to be trapped by it. And what you're doing by stepping back is showing them that you're not going to chase them, you're not going to beg for their attention, you're not going to settle for crumbs, and that pulls them in like nothing else. Why? Because people are drawn to strength. Not the I'm pretending to be strong kind of strength, but the genuine, rooted confidence that comes from knowing you're okay on your own. You don't need anyone else to validate your existence. You've got your own sense of worth and value, and you're not afraid to walk away when someone isn't matching that. That's what makes you magnetic. Now, think about it from their perspective. For an avoidant, love can feel like a trap. It feels like they're being put in a position where they have to give up a part of themselves. And so they pull back, they withdraw, they shut down. But then, when you go no contact, they're left in a place where they've got nothing to hold on to. And that space, the space where you walked away, is what makes them start to question everything they thought they knew. They start to wonder, why aren't you reaching out? Why aren't you fighting for me? And here's the kicker, they're not just asking about you. They're asking about themselves. They're looking in the mirror and thinking, if they can walk away from me, maybe I'm not as valuable as I thought I was. And that feeling, that insecurity, it hits them harder than they're willing to admit. It forces them to face the thing they've been avoiding, their own need for intimacy, their own desire for connection. But here's the irony. The moment you step back, the moment you take your power and stop chasing, you become more attractive to them than ever before. They start to feel the vacuum you left behind. They begin to question whether they made a mistake. They start to obsess over the unfinished story. You've become this unresolved enigma that they can't stop thinking about. They feel drawn to you, not because you're chasing them, but because you've become someone who knows what they deserve and won't settle for less. When you don't chase, you show them that you have options. You show them that you're not going to sit around waiting for them to decide if they want to be part of your life. That's incredibly powerful because it forces them to face their own emotional walls. You're not chasing, you're not begging, and that makes them realize that if they want to be in your life, they'll have to meet you at your level, not drag you down to theirs. This isn't about playing games. It's about emotional maturity. It's about knowing that you deserve respect, love, and care, and that you're not willing to compromise on that. When you're able to walk away and stand your ground, you're teaching them that you won't tolerate emotional unavailability. You won't allow yourself to be in a relationship where you feel like you're constantly chasing someone who's retreating. And that's powerful. That's a boundary that forces them to step up. At the same time, they can't help but wonder if they've lost something real. It's the unpredictability of your absence that makes them long for what they had. They start to romanticize the connection, imagining how good it could have been if only they hadn't pulled away. In their minds, you've become this symbol of everything they might have wanted but never truly allowed themselves to have. And that realization keeps them coming back. So, what does that mean for you? It means that walking away doesn't make you weaker, it makes you stronger. It's an act of self-respect that sends a clear message. I know who I am, and I know what I deserve. It's not about making them want you. It's about showing them what happens when you refuse to settle for anything less than what you're worth. When you reclaim your power, you take back control of your emotional well-being. You're no longer at the mercy of someone else's emotional unavailability. And that emotional distance, it creates a space where they can't help but be drawn to you. It's that mystery, that allure that makes you irresistible. So the next time you're tempted to chase, to reach out, to try to get them to see the light, remember, your value doesn't change based on whether they're paying attention or not. Your power lies in your ability to stand strong, to walk away if necessary, and to trust that if someone truly values you, they will find their way back.